Maybe my earliest memory of being rewarded for making art, which made me maybe want to be an artist, was I made Christmas cards for my relatives when I was 7 or 8 years old. And everyone was super appreciative except for my Uncle Tossie, who sort of muttered under his breath, "The boy needs to get outside more." So the idea of making art and people enjoying it, I think had an influence on the idea that I could be an artist. I'm Glenn Ligon, and I'm an artist living and working in New York. I think the artist that's most influenced me is David Hammons. I always look to David to think about how far one can go. David goes pretty far in his work. But also I think David is a model of how to operate in an art world that has demands and pressures on artists and what they make. And David has always made his own way in that art world. And so he's a constant teacher for me. One that's had a big influence on me is the Kooning painting called Pirate from the mid-70s. It's at the Museum of Modern Art, and I used to go make pilgrimages to it when I was young. I don't know if it's even the best de Kooning, but something about that painting seemed to me quite mystical, like it transmitted its meaning directly to my brain. And that's probably just because I needed glasses, and I didn't know it at the time. It's a hard question because my favorite museum is now currently closed. It's Studio Museum in Harlem. It's going to reopen in the fall of 25. It is my favorite museum because in the early 80s, I was an intern there. And it had then, as it does now and will have in the future, an artist in residence program. So it's the first time I'd been around living live Black artists who were working in the building. Sometimes artists need to find a home in an institution, and the Studio Museum has offered that to me. Usually when I'm starting a new body of work, I'll have an artist friend come over, and sometimes what they say changes the trajectory of what I'm doing. For example, I was making paintings based on children's coloring books. So I'd print out an image from a coloring book and then color it in, but they were terrible. And an artist friend, Stephen Andrews, came over and said, "Oh, you don't know how to color. You should get real kids to color these in and then copy how they colored the images." And so that was a big intervention in that series. And of course he was right. You know, I didn't actually color in coloring books when I was a kid. I copied things. So I drew the comics in the newspaper and sold them to my friends in elementary school. But I didn't have enough imagination to color things in, really. But I had enough imagination to copy them. The exhibition that had the biggest effect on me, it was actually a series of exhibitions. They were all curated by Oakley and Wazer, starting with Documenta that he put my work in, and the Venice Biennale, and a curatorial project called Grief and Grievance, which was at the New Museum in New York, that was done with a team of curators after Oakley had passed away. And so it was not only Oakley's curatorial vision that was important to me and his extraness, you know, in the sense that he always wanted artists to be ambitious about what they were showing. But also, when I came on as a curator or co-curator for Grief and Grievance, I realized how deeply thought through his exhibitions were and how nuanced and how geared towards the time they were. So even though he had passed away, it was an honor to be in dialogue with all of the ideas. I would say Baldwin is the writer whose work, whose essays in particular, more than the novels, have been an influence on me, particularly Stranger in the Village, which is an essay he wrote in the 1950s, where he was living in a little Swiss village and says for many of the villagers he is the first black person they'd ever seen. Goes on in that essay to give a panoramic overview of imperialism, colonialism, race relations. It's an amazing essay, 12 or 13 pages, but it's had a profound influence on my career. Dance has been a big influence. It's not something I'm involved with, though I have done sets for Kyla Abraham Dance Company. The way dancers use their body, the fact that dancers are a vessel for choreographers to work with, looking at Ralph Lemon, looking at Bill T. Jones, looking at Pina Bausch. These are choreographers and companies that I have always sought out and find inspiration from. I don't know what my influence has been as an artist, but I did put out a book of writings and interviews, and some of the essays in that book are users' guides for younger artists. So if I had any influence, it is through the writing. Hopefully the essays in that book will give people some idea of how to navigate the art world, or at least some cautionary tales to keep in mind as they do. Well, if I have any advice for you, for aspiring artists, I would say you have to be a bit hardcore at the beginning so people take you seriously, and you can be nice later on. But start hard, and then if it's going well, ease up.